woman in your life who will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily. She knows everything you do because the woman in your life is you.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Women's Spaces, and my name is Elaine Holtz and I'm your host. And I can't tell you how excited I am. We're at the Health and Harmony 2000 Fair, and I am privileged, and I mean privileged, to be able to talk with Amy Goodman, co-founder of Democracy Now! Before we get into the interview and I introduce Amy, I just want to tell you a few little bits about her. She began her career in 1985 in community radio at Pacifica Station WBAI, where she did the evening news for 10 years, and she co-founded Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report, in 1996. Since then, Democracy Now! Has been called probably the most significant progressive news institution that has come around in some time by Robert McChesney, who is an expert, I believe, in media. Amy Goodman has received several awards, just too many to mention, including the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award and the George Polk Award in 2001. According to Amy, a journalist's job, and I quote from her book, The Exception to the Ruler, that she wrote with her brother David, going where the silence is. That is the responsibility of a journalist, giving a voice to those who have been forgotten, forsaken, and beaten down by the powerful. Once again, I want to introduce Amy Goodman, and welcome to Women's Spaces, Amy.
It's nice to be here, Elaine. It's great to be here.
Oh, I am just so thrilled that I'm being able to just sit here and to bring you to public access in Sonoma and Mendocino counties. You know, the way we start our program out, Amy, is usually I ask my guests to give us a little background about yourself. You know, anything that you'd like to say, where you were born, what your family was like, whatever you feel comfortable.
Well, before I say anything, I want to do a shout out to KZYX&Z, to KRCB radio as well as television. I think that's, and also, of course, to KPFA. Community Radio, Pacifica, NPR, PBS, we're broadcasting on all of those stations.
Yes.
And it's an honor to be there and to be here with you, because community spaces, public media, is absolutely critical in time of war to have independent media. I was born in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. I grew up in New York, and my role models were my parents, my mom and my dad, both deeply involved in the peace movement and just in our community. My dad sat on the library board for 25 years. Our local library helped to integrate our schools, led a task force to integrate the schools of our community. My mother was a professor of women's studies, literature, and history, and then went on to be a social worker. Both very involved with the peace movement. My dad with Physicians for Social Responsibility, my mom with Sane Freeze at the time, that's what it was called, and establishing it on Long Island. And my grandparents, my brothers, they were my role models. And then the teachers I had, my friends. I've just been lucky enough to grow up in an environment where people, my family, deeply believed that we had an obligation in the world to make it better, that the Holocaust would never be repeated again against any group of people, that never again meant for everyone. And I see journalism as a way to engage in that kind of social justice work.
Well, we certainly have something in common, because I was born in 1940 at the heart of the Holocaust too. My father was born in Poland. And I remember so well my grandmother with a big basket of money just throwing it up in the air and say, "What good does this do?" I mean, it even gets me emotional when I even speak about it now. So we do have that in common.
Yes. Where in Poland?
Warsaw.
I visited Warsaw.
My grandmother did not like the United States when she came the first time. Then she went back, and then when World War I broke out and they started persecuting the Jews, they had to escape Well, she escaped during World War I, and then during World War II, that's when they tried to get the cousins and some of the other people that were involved. I just love your program. I mean, I've been listening to it for the past probably 8 years. How did you get involved in the media? I mean, what was that inspiration?
Well, my brother, my younger brother, who I write the books with, David, he started Dave's Press. I think he was 8 years old. And there were signs all over our house, arrows to Dave's Press, which was in his bedroom. And he had the kind of Xerox machine where you burn the image on, and he would do this newspaper for the greater extended family. Talk about the things we did every day. I think one day he said, on this date, Mom spanked Amy. And then my parents said, no dirty laundry. And my brother cried censorship. So we helped get out the newspaper. I think the subscription was something like 1 cent a month, and I was the collector. My grandfather would write in and say, Dear Davidal, I love you, but I disagree with you on the war. And David would respond back, Dear Grandpa, I think you're a very smart man, but you're stupid on the Vietnam War. And then my great uncle would write in, Saul, how could you say that to your grandson? And everyone would weigh in and battle it out. And that was, and then we just kept on in journalism. I was very active in my high school newspaper as the editor, and went on to do that. I just saw that as a way to get at issues of social justice, racial equality. And when I came back from college, that was really the first time I heard Pacifica. Even though I grew up in New York, I'd never tuned into our station. And I heard it and I was just transfixed, transformed. The idea that you could listen to New York through the myriad accents, the beauty, the horror, the ugliness, the remarkable melting pot, and not melting together that New York is. And no, there wasn't media that was trying to sell you anything. It's just people talking, and I was a goner from that point on.
Well, just like us, just two women talking and trying to express and trying to do. One of the things about Women's Spaces, it's dedicated to ordinary women doing extraordinary things. And my goal has been to try to encourage my listeners to get involved. Imagine if each one of us just did a little bit for peace, what the world would be like. You know, my biggest curiosity, I have two curiosities about you. And the first one is where do you get your energy? I mean, you're reporting on so many different things that are so negative.
I work with a remarkable team of people. It is definitely not just me. And they are devoted, they are driven, they work incredibly hard, and they're very smart. And they deeply care about the world. Mike Burke and Sharif Abdel-Qaddus and John Hamilton and Elizabeth Press. Yoruba Richin was with us for a long time now. She's in Brazil. And Ana Nogueira went Israel and Palestine. And Aaron Mate came from Canada. And now we're joined by Anjali Kamat, who grew up in India. Angie Karen, who's here in the West Coast. And Robbie Karen, who stays with us. And they're both from Guyana. I just work with a remarkable team of people.
So that gives you kind of your center, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
For myself, one of the things you said today that I thought was very positive is, because sometimes I tend to get a little depressed. Oh my goodness, do I have to hear that? And then suddenly I recognized when you were talking this afternoon, when you said it's the information that gives us power.
Yeah, it's information and the people who are doing something about it. And I find that everywhere. When I covered East Timor, it's the people of East Timor who were at the barrel end of U.S. foreign policy who actually had hope, even as they suffered such tremendous loss. People of Haiti during the U.S.-backed coups, politically aware, devastated, but organizing. People in this country. I'm just inspired by the people I cover.
One of the things I do is I ask my guests to talk to the camera, to maybe give a message or an encouragement for women to get involved, to do, even if it's a little bit. I even say if you just write your congressperson or your senator something, to do something for peace, something for the children. So just be my guest and just whatever you feel is in your heart that you would like to say.
Women are the leaders in this country and around the world, the leaders of the peace movement. Look at Cindy Sheehan and all that she did, even in her grief and her darkest days. organizing so that it would not happen to other mothers, or Medea Benjamin, of course, of Code Pink, and how important her work is, and all the women that she works with. Your work, working in a public access TV station. If we don't use these stations, we will lose them. The cable companies, the telephone companies, they want to write out public interest television, public access. We have to fight for it because these guys get a monopoly in a town. They can dig up the roads, they get the cables laid. And, well, media activists have fought for a few public interest channels in their communities, and we have to make sure that they are preserved. I'm deeply moved by people everywhere, and women, when organized, have such tremendous power. Being a part of this public access TV station, whether you want to be in front of the camera or behind the camera, you don't see what I see right now, which is the women that are running the cameras and producing this broadcast. But it really is, the media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile. The Pentagon's deployed the media, and we have to take it back. We have to do it together. Information is power. Information is hope. You have to find what you are most comfortable doing. Don't let someone say you should do this to make a difference. Do what you feel best doing, and that's what's sustainable. That's, by you doing that, you'll keep doing it, and you will inspire others.
Well, Amy, I could not have said it better. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, number one, for coming to Sonoma County, number two, for being so willing to give us this interview, and above all, for your courage, your tenacity, and all the wonderful things you do.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you.
This is Elaine Holtz with Women's Spaces saying thank you once again, Amy Goodman, and thank you all my listeners for listening. And remember, if all of us just did one little thing for peace, one little thing for the children, your children, our children, the children of the world, just imagine what this world would be like. This is Elaine Holtz with Women's Spaces saying, until the next time.
That was great.
Anyway,
thank you very much.
I sort of merged the two. But, well, you know, I can't claim credit for that last book that Gretchen just mentioned, Dar Jamal's book, but I do encourage you to read it. I'm just in the process of writing an introduction for it. But Dar is a remarkable journalist. I'm sure for those of you who listen to KPFA know how incredibly brave, one of the not many unembedded journalists in Iraq who made his way to Fallujah and did some remarkable reporting. Gretchen also just mentioned President Clinton, and one way that Democracy Now! Helps stations around the country is by offering people dinner and a show, you know, to come to New York, sit on the set of Democracy Now! And I go out to dinner and toast whatever station they're supporting. But I was just with some folks from KPFA yesterday for lunch, and, well, she reminded me of that story of Bill Clinton that I talked to them about yesterday. How many of you heard the interview with Bill Clinton? Well, I think it's very interesting. I write about it in The Exception to the Rulers, to expose the way other journalists operate and what rules of agreement, unstated rules, journalists follow that have to be challenged. It was Election Day 2000. Remember that day that, well, our broadcast then was at 9 in the morning. Now we do it at 8 Eastern Standard Time. And we knew it was going to be a long day because it was Election Day. We figured, you know, we'd start early in the morning and then be there till like, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning when they announced the president. Well, actually, it was 5 weeks later. Remember when they announced the selection, not to be confused with election, of President Bush. Well, it was a few minutes to 9. I had 2 producers with me at the time. Maria Carrion, a wonderful woman who joined us from Spain, and Brad Simpson, who is a history grad student. They were producing the show with me that day. They'd already run into this was when we were just doing radio, and they ran into the master control room at WBAI, and the music was swelling, and I got this call right before I ran in, and they said it was White House Communications. And I thought they said White Horse Communications. See, White Horse is famous in New York, the White Horse Tavern. It's where Dylan Thomas drank himself to death. It's a historic tavern. And I was very puzzled. Everyone knew, don't call right before Democracy Now! Unless you have some breaking news. And I said, White House Communications? And they said, that's right, the president would like to speak to you. And I said, the president of what? I mean, did this tavern have a president? And what was he doing up at 9 in the morning? And they said, the president of the United States of America. I said, oh, White House Communications. Oh, now I thought, I don't know that I could believe this. So I said, yeah, right. So no, he's calling in. He's telling people to get out the vote. Of course, then Hillary Rodham Clinton, his wife, Al Gore, was running for president. She was running for first time for senator in New York. So I said, okay, whatever. And they were screaming at me in control room, get in here, get in here. So I ran in, and they were completely harried, the producers. I said, by the way, the president might call. I said, the president of what? The president of the United States. Think of some questions in case he does. I didn't believe this for a minute. So we did the show, he didn't call, no surprise. And we were going out for coffee because it was going to be a long day. They'd announced president around 1 in the morning, or so we thought. We're just walking out of BAI, and we hear this terrified scream out of the control room. Get in here now! President Clinton is on the phone. Well, it was the Latino music show that was on at the time. My colleague Gonzalo was at the controls. I ran into the control room. He was paralyzed. His hands were like this. The salsa music was up. All the microphones were down. And you could hear drowning in the salsa beat, hello, is anyone there? It was President Clinton on the airwaves of WBAI. So I threw myself over the audio board, threw down all the music faders, picked up all the mics in the room, like 7 of them, so the whole room was hot, meaning you really couldn't talk or it would be picked up. And I said, yes, Mr. President. People wonder why they should go out and vote, that perhaps the parties are captured by the corporations. And he responded. And he, of course, objected, but he explained why he objected to this. But, you know, he was still on the phone, so I asked him about Leonard Peltier. Leonard Peltier, who remains in prison for more than 30 years now. And it was President Clinton who could grant him executive clemency, and he'd never spoken about this in public. So I asked him, would he be granting him clemency? We talked about that, and then, well, Gonzalo joined in, and we asked him a lot of questions. We asked him about the bombing of Vieques, Puerto Rico, the napalming of it, and what about the people who live there, U.S. citizens? Why was the U.S. Navy bombing U.S. citizens? Why is the U.S. bombing any citizens anywhere? Asked him about the sanctions against Iraq, and this is very important because we have to understand the continuum. We look at what's happened today in Iraq, but it didn't start with Bush. The Clinton-Gore administration was in power for 8 years. They imposed sanctions in Iraq, which increases, I think, our immunity to visions of horror. How many children died during that period, not to mention intermittently bombing Iraq. But how many children died at that time? At least 500,000. Remember when Leslie Stahl, credit to her at CBS, questioned Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State at the time, asking her, this 500,000 children who have died in Iraq, do you really think the price was worth it? And she said, yes, it was worth it. this happened during the Clinton-Gore years. So I asked President Clinton about the sanctions and about the fact that 2 assistant UN Secretary Generals, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, had quit, calling the sanctions regime genocidal. And he said they were liars and it wasn't true, President Clinton, in our interview. I asked him about racial profiling, because Vice President Gore, running for president, said it would be his first act in office as president to outlaw racial profiling, which is very important. Except that, as I put the question to President Clinton, you guys have been in office for 8 years. Why didn't you do it through any of those years? This is the difference between questioning people on their record versus taking what they say as promises and believing them. And he responded, and then I asked him about Ralph Nader. Tomorrow I'll be in Washington, D.C. interviewing Ralph Nader. We'll play it on Democracy Now!, I guess, next week. But I asked him about Ralph Nader's success at the time and said, can't his success really be attributed to you because you took the Democratic Party to the right? Now Clinton got mad. And he said, I find you hostile, combative, and at times disrespectful. To which I said I only had a few more questions. But anyway, we talked for about half an hour, and it got some headlines, because you don't usually have such a long interview with the President of the United States. And the next day I got a call from our local newspaper, Newsday. And as I was on with them, I got another call. So I just put the phone down, and that reporter listened to this whole conversation. It was the White House. They said I was being banned from the White House. And I said, what are you talking about? He called me. I didn't call him. And they said, well, I had violated all the rules. And I said, what rules? And they said, they told me he was calling to get out the vote. And I said, that is true, but that doesn't oblige me to ask a certain set of questions. And they said, my questions related to getting out the vote, 1, 4, and 7. They had clearly studied the questions, but that all the others strayed from the topic. And I said, it's true, I had not submitted my questions in advance, hadn't gotten a call telling me he'd call in advance, but had he done other interviews? They said, yes, of course, like 40 in New York on radio stations. And I said, and none of them asked other questions? And they said no. And furthermore, they said, they had said he could speak for 2 or 3 minutes. And I had talked to him for more than 30 minutes. And I said, for God's sakes, he is the leader of the free world. He's the most powerful person on earth. He can hang up if he wants to. Anyway, they said he actually enjoyed the conversation, but still I wouldn't be allowed in the White House. So I said, I'm sure I'll be around a little longer than you will be. And that was it. But, as I said outside, we have to challenge this unspoken agreement between reporters and those in power, that you ask the softball questions so that you can ask another one and another one. We have to challenge the access of evil, because these men are so insulated in the White House. The press corps should not be another ring of insulation, but should be opening the doors, breaking the sound barrier. Every time we ask a question at Pacifica or Democracy Now!, I feel everyone who can't be there on my shoulders, behind me. What an awesome responsibility it is that we have. If there's a way to ask a question, the questions that so many people have on so many different issues, instead of being that protection for these men, like Henry Kissinger. When was the last time you saw this man challenged? On all of the networks, he is brought on as an elder statesman. statesman. I think what has to be done when he is interviewed is flashing the amount of money he gets from the countries that he is representing through Kissinger Associates. So for starters, you can see how he profits off warring with other countries. But then the basic questions have to be asked, and that's about his involvement in terrorism. Pure and simple. Now, Russell McIver had that idea. He's a wonderful journalist in Washington, D.C., who does the Corporate Crime Reporter. Goes out to a lot of law firms around the country, this newsletter about white-collar crime. He was going to the White House every day in the lead up to the invasion. But then the invasion began. Russell is an Arab-American reporter. And he wasn't able to get into the White House anymore for a month. I was just thinking of another Arab-American reporter. I mean, they don't identify themselves as this, and in one way it may not be even relevant, but that other Arab-American reporter who often sits in the front row, the dean of the White House press corps, Helen Thomas, who when she asks questions, invariably they're about civilian casualties, somewhat along the lines of, how many Iraqis did you kill today? Day after day after day. Now, the press secretaries cannot get away from her question. She's covered 10 presidents. They just ridicule her, marginalize her. And it's up to the rest of the press to demand that those questions be answered before they ask about who gave the president his golf clubs or whatever it is they're asking that day. That's how you get a question answered, is by repeating the question over and over, and by having follow-up from other reporters that won't go on until a question is answered. It's absolutely essential that those with access use that access seriously. And if we lose our access, continue the journalism, don't let them determine the stories, continue to get sources outside, because so often there is much more truth to be found on the outside. I mean, you think about the whole allegation of weapons of mass destruction and what the media did. Over and over again, interviewing those who represented the media line, the Bush administration line, over and over again. And the Bush administration caught on very quickly. They know how powerful the media is. So that on September 8th, I think it was 2002, if that was the Sunday, the day the New York Times had that front page story by Judith Miller and Michael Gordon, alleging that Saddam Hussein was getting more nuclear weapons. Dick Cheney, the vice president, the former head of Halliburton, the largest oil services corporation in the world. Yes, what we see in Washington is the ascendancy of the oligarchy, right? You have President Bush, a failed oil man, Vice President Dick Cheney, former head of Halliburton. You have Condoleezza Rice, now Secretary of State, sat on the board of, well, Chevron for more than 10 years. Actually had an oil tanker named after her, the Condoleezza Rice, until it was too embarrassing for the administration. They took the name off. Andrew Card, who recently, if you read the headlines, well, our headlines, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, was being given an honorary degree. I think it was his alma mater. Did you see what happened in that graduation ceremony? Well, if you watch Democracy Now!, you did. We have the video. That's the power of being able to do TV and radio. Just go to our website and put in Andrew Card and you will see. It was astounding. They weren't able to revoke the special degree he was getting, the honorary diploma, but they were able to speak their mind. There was Andrew Card, the former chief of staff of President Bush. Before that, he was a GM lobbyist. That's right, General Motors. the oilty in Washington. Being booed by the students, by the staff, by the faculty standing behind him, holding up banners, saying no to card and yes to the students. The level of resistance in this country is enormous, as it is around the world. We just need a media that covers that resistance, that part of, well, our book Static, covering the movements that create static and make history. It is so important because these are the movements that are making history. Movements that I dare say many of you are a part of. We need a media that gives voice to these because you are more powerful than the man setting policy, than the people setting policy in Washington, be they Democrat or Republican. But back to Kissinger. We now know that Kissinger regularly, I believe almost weekly, advising President Bush on the war from the beginning. And you look back at all that he has been involved with. If only we had a media that told the truth. Many of you have heard me give the litany of September 11th. How many of you have heard me go through that? September 11th. And how important it is to understand how we are connected to people victimized by terror all over the world. September 11, 2001 wasn't the first time that date was connected to terror. Democracy Now! Was broadcasting on that day when the second plane hit the second tower. Broadcasting 9 to 10, now 8 to 9. The first plane hit at 8:47, the second at 9:03. We didn't even know what hit us. We were just blocks from ground zero. We broadcast out of the garret of a 100-year-old firehouse. There were no windows. But interestingly enough, we were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973, the day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile as the Pinochet forces rose to power. The US-backed Pinochet forces, the Kissinger-backed Pinochet forces, the Nixon-backed Pinochet forces, the ITT-backed Pinochet forces. And of course, Pinochet ruled for 17 years, killing thousands of Chileans and others. And then there was September 11th, 1990 in Guatemala. The Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack died at the hands of security forces in Guatemala backed by the United States. And September 11th, 1977 in South Africa, Steve Biko, founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, being beaten to death in the back of a van by US-backed apartheid forces. Died in the early morning hours of September 12th. In fact, September 12th is Leonard Peltier's birthday, who remains in prison over 30 years. Just recently, his lawyers in federal court demanded more documents. They thought they had almost all of them during his trial, but it turns out there are well over 90,000 more pages that they want access to free this Native American leader. And they were denied based on national security this year, 30 years after he was in prison on national security, for national security reasons. September 11th, 1971, Attica, the prison uprising, upstate New York, prisoners protesting prison conditions. We will never actually know how many people died on that day, on September 11th, 2001, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death, and they were the undocumented workers who work at the World Trade Center, and we should know their names, we should know their stories, because that's what dignifies a life. But think about how we are connected to people all over. And in those ensuing days, as we hunkered down in the firehouse, we were within the evacuation zone. We felt it was absolutely critical to get out the voices of people in pain at ground zero who were not saying, well, like that sticker said that went up all over New York, who were saying, our grief is not a cry for war. They were in terrible pain. But they were gathering in parks with candles and flowers, debating, discussing, comforting each other. This was not being projected to the rest of the world. And we felt it was critical we break the sound barrier with people like Rita Lasar, who lost her brother Abe Zalmanowitz on the 27th floor of the World Trade Center. He worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield next to his best friend Ed. And Abe could have left, could have gotten out, but he wanted to wait till the emergency workers came up to help Ed down because he was a paraplegic. And they went down. They died with so many others. And Rita, a remarkable woman, who is the mother of Matthew Lasar, who wrote the history of Pacifica Radio. Rita heard President Bush's speech a few days later at the National Cathedral. He invoked the story of Abe Zalmanowitz and called him a national hero. And she said no. And she wrote a letter to the New York Times that amazingly enough did get published, where she said that would only increase her suffering if a woman in Afghanistan lost her brother. She said, not in my name, not in my brother's name. And there was Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who lost their son, Greg Ernesto Rodriguez. He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald above the 100th floor of the World Trade Center. Cantor Fitzgerald lost 700 of 1,000 workers that day. They hunkered down with their family and wrote a letter to President Bush that didn't get published but swirled around the internet. They said the same thing. It would not decrease their pain to know that a mother and father in Afghanistan would soon lose their son, not in our name, not in our son's name. And this nationwide movement grew up, not in our name. September 11th, Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And sometimes we saw them on television, telling the stories of their loved ones who were heroes. But when they moved from description to prescription, what should happen, that's when the media cut away. They could describe their loved ones, their accomplishments, what they lost. But when they moved to what they felt should happen, the media cut away. And they brought us the so-called experts in terrorism, the Oliver Norths and the Henry Kissingers. Henry Kissinger. I think the corporate media got it right in that case. The experts in terrorism. It takes one to know one. You know, I think it was Henry Kissinger, before even President Bush, said we should not only go after the terrorists, but bomb the countries they come from. And I was very afraid, because I lived in New York, so does Henry Kissinger. Yes, we have to take this very seriously. We have to have a universal standard of justice. You have to look at Chile and his involvement there. You have to look at Argentina and his support of the generals in the dirty war that led to the deaths of 30,000, mainly dissidents in Argentina. You have to look at Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and the millions who died there, not to mention the more than 50,000 US soldiers. You have to look at his role in Timor, the genocide there. He went with President Ford right before December 7th, 1975, gave the go-ahead for Indonesia's invasion of Timor. And on December 7th, in 1975, the Indonesian army, armed by the United States, trained by the United States, financed by the United States, 90% of their weapons from the United States, invaded East Timor and commenced their slaughter. Yes, I think Osama bin Laden and his accomplices should be tried for what happened on September 11th, but I also think Henry Kissinger should be tried for war crimes. When we see this universal standard of justice used, more importantly, when others around the world see that we have a uniform, believe in a universal standard of justice, that's what's going to make us safer. How is it that the US is involved in torture? In this extraordinary term, extraordinary rendition, which is simply White House for kidnapping. As we speak, as we gather here today in Sonoma County in Santa Rosa, there's a trial going on in Italy. Dozens of CIA agents are on trial. Unless you listen to KPFA or KRCB or Democracy Now! Or KZYX and Z, you probably wouldn't know about this. Dozens of US CIA agents for kidnapping a sheikh off the streets of Milan. Okay, they're being tried in absentia. The US won't turn them over. they were involved in an extraordinary rendition of a sheikh to Egypt, where he says he was tortured. And he is one of, it is believed, thousands who have been kidnapped from the streets, from airports. Maher Arar, how many of you have heard of him? You're good listeners and viewers. Most people in this country have never heard of this Canadian citizen. It was September 2002. He was heading home from a family vacation a few days ahead of his wife and kids. Computer analyst, making his way through JFK to Canada. He's taken out of JFK, he's interrogated, put in a New York detention facility, held for 2 weeks, and then he is deported home to Canada, which would have made sense if the US government thinks he is related to Al-Qaeda or a terrorist, deporting him to his home country, let them jail him, try him, and if they find him guilty, punish him. But no, they don't send him home. They send him to Syria. He was born in Syria, but he left when he was 17, fled the country with his family, didn't serve in the army, was afraid that he would be tortured if he went back. And when he heard what they were doing, he said, please, not Syria. They will torture me. And that is exactly where he was sent and put in a grave-like cell, held for 10 months and 10 days, brutally interrogated and tortured. And then as inexplicably as he was taken, he was released home to Canada, a broken man. I've spoken to him a number of times since then. And it's always the most simple or mundane story that I think hits home the most, like saying how he can piece his personality, how he can put it back together after his ordeal. Going to his little girl's school. He says the time he treasures most now is just the time with his family, to pick up his daughter. And he goes with her to the gym and he says, get your things. And he flashes back to them saying, get your things. Trying to piece together a life. Well, a Canadian Judicial Commission did an investigation of what happened to Maher Arar. They did a many hundred-page report, a few months ago released it, and said this man is completely innocent. The Bush ally Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada held a news conference, condemned what the US government had done, and awarded Maher Arar $10 million. The US government not only will not apologize, the court has thrown out his case on national security grounds. He's suing the US government, but continues to maintain him on a US no-fly list. A US no-fly list. By the way, Maher Arar was just named by Time magazine as one of the most 100 influential people, is it of the decade or the century, something like that, and yet most people in this country don't know his name. He is a household name in Canada. We live in a globalized world, yet we are so insulated when it comes to getting information in this country, especially information that shows the effect of, I dare say, our policy. Because whether we like it or not, it represents us, and we can change it. The US is us. But Maher Arar, extraordinary rendition. How could it be that this continues to take place in our name? You know, I was with Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, as I said, outside on Patriots Day. In the morning, brought them into a studio to have this conversation with two leading dissidents. And then in the evening, I went with Howard Zinn to Faneuil Hall, where we held a big town hall meeting. It was a horrible day in terms of weather. It was the Boston Marathon. If you remember, they were almost blown off the streets. But people packed in to see this great historian, Howard's Inn. Faneuil Hall is an amazing place in Boston. It's a historic hall. Daniel Webster spoke there. Frederick Douglass spoke there. Frederick Douglass, that great orator, the leading abolitionist, who, when he spoke, he trembled, he shook, because he was speaking from his own experience. Frederick Douglass was born in the eastern shore of Maryland, and he had been enslaved as a child and a teenager. And he was handed over to a man named Edward Covey, who was known as a slave breaker. The troublesome slaves were given to Covey for him to break. And he beat Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass fought back, broke away, headed north, and changed the world. Edward Covey's property on the eastern shore of Maryland was called Mount Misery. Mount Misery today is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. It's his vacation home. He bought it in 2003 to be down the road from his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. Now, I've told this story a lot since I learned it, but I still found it incredibly hard to believe. So I thought I would go investigate for myself. So I drove to the eastern shore of Maryland, to St. Michael's, where these two pals live, where they vacation. And I thought, well, how could I find if this is true? We drove up to an organic coffee shop. I figured that's where we'd get the truth. And asked them where Donald Rumsfeld lived. And they said, you just go down the road, make a left, make a right, and he's at the end of the road. So we got in the car, we went down the road, and we saw ahead of us Mount Pleasant. We knew that couldn't be it. So we made a left. And then sure enough, the road parallel to that was Mount Misery Road. And we drove down it, and as we came closer, I could see the Secret Service, so we slowed up, I got out, and started filming. They weren't pleased with that, but as I watched, as I filmed, the Secret Service, the property, I saw the stake in the ground. Make no mistake about it, Donald Rumsfeld knows where he lives. The stake in the ground says Mount Misery. That's where you'll find the former Secretary of Defense. The man who, together with the Attorney General, who apparently they plan to have a vote of no confidence in the Senate this week, though you do have to ask, what about impeachment? Yes, the Attorney General can be impeached. They're talking about his involvement in the U.S. attorney firings. I think the numbers come to 9 at this point, but there's probably others. But is that the most serious of crimes? I think Alberto Gonzalez should go down over the torture memos, right? You have Professor John Yoo at University of California, Berkeley, involved in writing these memos, the former State Department Justice lawyer, Bybee, who's now a judge, all involved in laying the foundation for torture, the legal framework for torture, saying that torture could only be defined as physical injury that would result in death. Alberto Gonzalez, Donald Rumsfeld, Vice President Cheney, President Bush, the media, day after day, should be raising the real crimes. If we had justice in this country, when you look at people like Agustin Aguayo, the young Army medic who went to basic training, and through that basic training said he came to realize he was a conscientious objector. Maybe that was a bit late, but that's when he understood he could not kill anyone, that he would rather be killed. Deployed to Iraq, refused to load his gun for a year, applied for CO status. His IO, his investigating officer, said, "This is the real deal. This guy is a real conscientious objector." He goes back to his base in Germany, living with his wife and twin daughters, 11 years old, and they tell him he's going right back. They bring him to the house to get his things. He jumps out the back window, goes AWOL. We interview him in a studio in Los Angeles later that day. He turned himself into Fort Irwin. He's been court-martialed, went to prison, just recently flew to San Francisco, where he immediately commenced a speaking tour. And then you have Aaron Wattada being court-martialed again, most likely the first officer to say no to Iraq, to deployment in Iraq, saying he didn't want to lead young men and women to an immoral war. You have to ask, if we lived in a just society, who would be behind bars and who would be free? I just want to end by saying I'll talk to people just outside here. I'll be signing books. You could get The Exception to the Rulers or Static, or you don't have to get a book. I'm happy to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming here, for coming to the Harmony Festival. Most importantly, for paying attention. It's extremely important. I'm always amazed what people say about Democracy Now! As we cover the most difficult issues, that they say it gives them hope. And I think that's because information is power. Information is hope. Because when you know what's happening, then you can decide in your own way, in your own world, in your own field, with your own friends, in whatever way you feel most comfortable. You can decide what you want to do about it. And it's tremendously hopeful when you hear you're not alone, that people in every corner of the globe are working in their own ways. Now, it is much harder for many in Nigeria, in Timor, in Haiti, on Guantanamo, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, because they're at, as my colleague, great journalist Alan Nairn often says, they are at the target end of US foreign policy. You are at the trigger end. You decide whether that trigger is pulled. And if there's one finger that's pulling that trigger, that's the lethal motion. It takes many, many people to stop it. That's you. That's you deciding in whatever way you feel most comfortable, in whatever profession you're in, or walk of life you're in, whether you're a journalist or a farmer or an artist, activist, nurse, doctor, lawyer, teacher, student, whether you're employed or unemployed, we have a decision to make every day, every hour of every day, whether to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy Now!
The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily. She knows everything you do because the woman in your life is you. The woman in your life knows simply what is true. She knows a simple way to touch to make you whole now. The woman in your life, she can touch